My shift at the coffee shop ended at 1 p.m. and Andy, a coworker, and I rushed to the south side of Milwaukee to get to our favorite all-you-can-eat vegetarian lunch buffet before it closed. It was a Palestinian restaurant with fresh pita bread, tabbouleh, stuffed grape leaves, hummus, baba ganoush, soups, and falafel, all for something like $7. Andy was one of those talkers who knew the owners of every restaurant he went to. And eventually the owner's daughter came out and started to eat lunch with us. Somehow or another, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict gets brought up. Andy was definitely pro-Palestinian. I agreed, except that I could not side with suicide bombers. The owner's daughter started to cry. You have no idea what it's like to live under occupation, where you have nothing and nothing to lose. She was right. I have no idea what it's like to be a refugee in my own land. I have no idea what it's like to live in a war zone. And I hope none of us do as well. About a month ago, on October 7th, Hamas orchestrated a well-planned out surprise attack. They sabotaged Israeli communication towers with drones, used their tunnel system, and breached the militarized borders with Israel in a sophisticated plot, killing soldiers in their sleep, gunning down concert goers early in the morning, killing families, babies, and ordinary Israelis at a bus stop. Some even proudly recording it all. 1,400 in all are killed, and another 240 are kidnapped. This hideous carnage is indefensible. It is not too surprising that Jews would feel the horror of the Holocaust and the pain of the pogroms all over again. Israel does have the right to defend itself. And since October 7th, they have been launching intense missile strikes, and Israeli forces are now in Gaza. Hamas says that over 9,000 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli military in this past few weeks, a large number of them being under the age of 18. The US and other Western democracies fully support Israel. But with fears of a larger war and a humanitarian crisis, the Biden administration is now calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. How did we get to this point? Is peace possible? To say the least, these are complex questions with complex answers, and I may have bitten off more falafel than I can chew. I do not know fully all the intricacies, but I know this. This is a long conflict, but not an ancient one. So prior to World War I, the Ottoman Empire ruled the Middle East for roughly 500 years. Most of the people living in what we now call Palestine were Islamic Arabs with small pockets of Christians and Jews living in relative peace. It's safe to say that Jews have not had a majority of people there, nor anything resembling a nation, since about the year 300 of the Common Era. Even biblical Israel was never really a defined nation with static boundaries like we might think of today. As Jews lost power and moved around the world, the Jewish religion became independent of the temple in Jerusalem, and it became untied to the Holy Land, a rabbinic tradition creatively adapted that could be transported anywhere in the Jewish diaspora. In Europe, Jews had a remarkable degree of self-government That is, until the 19th century, albeit as second-class citizens. Europe's rise of nationalism in the late 1800s led to more and more anti-Semitism. Hope for Jews to have a peaceful existence with full rights became bleaker and bleaker. Zionists began to dream of a Jewish homeland. This primarily secular movement was modeled on European colonization. They raised the money to buy land and started moving into what we would now call Palestine in the early 1900s. To promote their cause, Zionists used phrases like a land without people for a people without land. But there's a big problem. The land already had people on it. To me, it sounds a bit like Christopher Columbus or other Europeans coming to this continent and assuming that no one was here and claiming it for itself. Zionists lobbied European capitals to help them build a Jewish homeland. London listened most closely. They listened most closely because they could see that European Jews were being mistreated. And it fed into this idea that Jews really are a nation unto themselves and can never be loyal to a European nation. Great Britain benefits by getting European settlers because they had always wanted to keep an overland trade route to India, make sure the Suez Canal operates, and they wanted to curb Russian expansionism. Initially, the Zionists are interested in arable land, not in the historic cities of the Hebrew Scriptures. By 1914, approximately 85,000 Jews settle in Palestine, mostly in valleys, lowlands, near the sea. Initially, Jews hire Arabs for their labor, but the economies of Arabs and Jews become more and more separate. Jews are not assimilating into Arab culture, and Arabs are not assimilating into Jewish culture. And there is little cooperation between the two cultures. The Ottoman Empire, which was allied with Germany, falls after World War I. The League of Nations assigns the Palestinian Mandate to Great Britain, which allows them to rule and govern the area with the expectation that it will become self-governed countries in time. Great Britain promises Palestinian territory to France, Egypt, and to the Zionists. During Great Britain's rule, they gave self-governing power to Jews, but not to Arabs, even though at the beginning of the mandate, there were approximately 70,000 Jews and 700,000 Arabs. Great Britain deliberately played upon Arab divisions and rivalry to make their power never develop. Large-scale clashes between Zionists and Arabs began in 1920. For me, it's hard not to compare this to other colonizing efforts around the globe, apartheid in South Africa, or in North America, where Europeans have all the power, giving none to the indigenous peoples. Zionists are forming militias, Arab resistant movements are beginning, and out of it, a Palestinian national identity emerges. Britain imposes restrictions on Jewish immigration and land purchase and calls for an independent Palestinian state. This upsets the Jewish settlers. No one is happy with Great Britain. After World War II, Great Britain doesn't want to deal with this anymore and requests the newly created United Nations take care of all this. United Nations decides on a two-state solution. Even though the Jewish population was much smaller than Arabs, they were allotted more land. In post-World War II, there is a sense of siding with Jews out of guilt for the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. The Zionists and make a strong case for statehood to prevent such atrocities again. Eventually, an all-out civil war breaks out in Palestine. Israel declares itself a country in 1948 along the lines that the United Nations said. Egypt occupies the Gaza Strip. Jordan annexes the West Bank, lands that were supposed to become Palestinian. Skipping ahead here, in 1967, war breaks out between Israel, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The Israeli military is now subsidized by the US and European powers, and they decisively win in a 6-day war that doubles their land. Israel gains the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel becomes an occupying force. In 1979, Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty, and they gave the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. Though there are many attempts, eventually Jordan normalizes relationships with Israel. Though there are many attempts by the US and other world leaders for a peace deal between Palestinians and Israelis, nothing ever really happens. Starting in the late 1980s, there's a series of terrorists and guerrilla attacks by Palestinians. This is when Hamas is first organized. Hamas wins elections in the Gaza Strip in 2006 and then cancels any future elections, remaining in power in Gaza and becoming enemies with the Palestinian Authority, which has governed in Gaza, had governed in Gaza and continues in the West Bank. So we throw around these terms, Gaza and West Bank, just to give you a sense of size. The occupied West Bank could easily fit within St. Lawrence County with 500 square miles to spare. About 3 million Palestinians live there in the West Bank. If you look on a map, there's pockets of Palestinians controlled areas within the West Bank. It looks more, and there's military checkpoints and walled-in areas. It looks from a map like reservations. The Gaza Strip is 25 miles long and about 7 miles wide at its deepest part. This 25 miles is approximately from here to Governor. And would be 2 million people living there. One of the most densely populated areas in the world. So Israel, out of fear of Hamas, pulled out of all settlements within Gaza and has been controlling their borders and allowing only the goods and people they want to pass in and out. Many of the Palestinians that live in Gaza and the West Bank have been displaced themselves and are refugees themselves. Other Palestinians have fled to countries like Egypt and Syria, where they are not given full rights. So this is not an ancient religious battle between Jews and Muslims. And this is not primarily a Middle East problem. It is a European colonial conflict. Now, I can't go into all the battles and wars and skirmishes, but a pattern emerges. Hamas and other militants will do something hideously cruel, and Israel will respond with disproportionate military might. They think it will deter attacks and perhaps make people accept their presence. This is a cycle of violence, where each side then sees itself as innocent victims acting against injustice. And this is right where we are now. War is not inevitable. It doesn't have to keep on. Peace is a possibility. Israel is the occupying and colonial force with all the power and should start shouldering more of the responsibility for peace. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seems perfectly content to manage the conflict with no interest of a permanent peace. Conflict grows, Israeli military mows it down. It's like mowing the grass. His party is the mainstream conservative one. In a sense, they're kind of similar to Republicans here. But in order to have a government, they align themselves with ultra-nationalist parties who believe God promised this land to the Jews and only the Jews, and they push and push for annexing the West Bank. Though illegal, Israel gives incentives to extremists, ultra-nationalists to settle in the West Bank. This looks to me not unlike US settler colonial movement that betrayed hundreds of treaties with indigenous people. And it does not give Hamas terrorists the right to kill innocent people. In these past few weeks, I've been contemplating how Israelis can live in such a rich, Western, suburban, quite happy lives in affordable settlements, all within miles of Palestinians living in extreme poverty without human rights. And I bring that question back to myself, because I know we in this country do something very similar. Go to any major city in the US, or just drive down Jingleville Road sometime. How can Israel keep making these illegal settlements? It can be done. I'm sure you're all familiar with US history and the plight of indigenous people. How can the Israeli military knowingly kill civilians? What do you think our military has done in Iraq and Afghanistan and throughout its history? Per capita, the US doles out the most financial and military aid to Israel. I say the US hold back its aid unless Israel is committed to a long-term peace. The United Nations recently voted for a ceasefire. Prime Minister Netanyahu accused those who voted yes of preferring to support the defense of Nazi terrorists instead of Israel. It seems like every time someone critiques Israel, they're accused of being an anti-Semite or a terrorist sympathizer. Critiquing Israel is not anti-Semitic. And all Jews are not to blame for Israel's aggression and military might. On college campuses right now, in New York State, on Cornell University, Jewish students are getting death threats and blamed for Israel's military. This is equally indefensible. You can support Israel's right to exist and Palestine's. It is quite possible Israel and Palestine are both right and both wrong. Israel won't allow a Palestinian state to emerge because they fear a Hamas government could form there. Hamas is a terrorist organization that wants to destroy Israel. Palestinian and Arab and all Arab nations have to officially recognize Israel as a nation. Fair or unfair, Israel has that power. Hamas uses civilians as shields. Israel surely won't bomb hospitals because Hamas headquarters are in them and below them, will they? This looks like collective punishment. This war will go on for many more months, and many more innocent civilians will die. there is always the possibility of a larger war emerging. Egypt and Jordan and Syria can't handle these refugees. And let's say Israel does destroy Hamas. Then what? A destroyed Gaza? A power vacuum? Israel is just going to keep occupying, and a new generation of militants will emerge. I'm not sure Israeli leaders are looking into the future. And this, I am 100% confident of. Jewish life is equal to Muslim life. Israeli life is equal to Palestinian life. There could be a one-state solution, an Israeli democracy with rights for all, where occupied Palestinians have the rights to vote, equal rights to land ownership, and reparations. However, Palestinians are having more children than Jews. Israel fears what is now a minority will become a majority, not a Jewish homeland. Segregation and doing nothing is in Israel's favor. I'm not going to hold my breath for a two-state solution, but it is possible. It would need new leaders on both sides. The barbaric nature of Hamas killings and Israeli bombardments make the two-state solution look grim. But the Jewish prophet, Micah, he lived in war-torn times, and he still had a vision for peace, where swords are made into plows, spears into pruning hooks, where people do not train for war anymore, vineyards and fig trees for everyone to sit under. You know, it typically takes 3 years for a new vine to produce grapes. But well tended, they will produce for 100 years. A fig tree may take 5 years to produce figs, but in the right conditions could produce the piece of fruit for centuries. Tanks can be melted down into buses. A dismantled nuclear bomb's radioactive material can be used to power electricity plants. It may take years, but peace is possible. So may it be, and amen.